Earlier this week, I pulled into a Lowe's that I pass all the time, and I put on my mask and I walked in. And I stood in there before this whole wall that they have of seed packages. And standing there in my mask looking at these seeds, I ended up behaving in a way that is basically the exact opposite way that I normally behave. And normally, I stand there trying to figure out the costs and consider the effectiveness of what I purchase or the efficiency of which seeds should go in which location or whatever, but not this time. This time, instead of buying the cheapest package of seeds that I could find, I purchased the most expensive pack I could find on the wall. And I purchased it and have no real purpose for it. I just bought it to put into my hand and bring with me out here, to put into my hand and spread. Which to me is, I think, a symbol of God's lavishness for us. When Jesus tells the story of the parable of the sower, he tells it in such a way that the seeds that are being sown are so plentiful and so much that they can basically just be sown in any old haphazard way. They're expensive seeds, and they can just be gathered and put down. And God has such a depth to draw from that God is able to cast those seeds all over the place. And the question that Matthew poses for us with the parable of the sower is what this means for us. If the seeds that God sows are seeds of salvation and peace, seeds of justice and joy, and if the wellspring that God pulls these from is so deep that God can just spread these wherever they would go, because the bottomless pit from which he draws is always accessible with this abundance of these things. The question Matthew asks is what does this mean for us? What does it mean for us to be a people who have been adopted and accepted in the waters of our baptism by a God who is so abundant and so lavish? This parable of the sower is about God's abundance, but it's also a statement to you and I. We tend to worry a lot about efficiency or effectiveness. I sit in all sorts of meetings, which, by the way, in and of themselves are not always that efficient or effective. And a lot of the way to restrict or hold back or make sure that we're spending our time is to make sure that everything is very efficient and very effective. Now, don't get me wrong, we only have so many resources. We're stewards of these resources. So the way that we are efficient and effective a lot of times is great. But when it comes to the gospel and when it comes to justice and joy and peace and patience, these are things that we're not supposed to spend all this time with efficiency and with limiting and with beating around the bush on, but that we, because we follow by the Spirit, follow in the footsteps of God, God's self, we're called to sow these things the same way for others and in our world as they've been sown in us. It's a movement away from effectiveness and efficiency to taking risks. Taking risks. This is what I think Luther's talking about when he says that you and I are baptized, and in our baptism we now have salvation and peace and patience and joy and are the hands of justice, so we should go forth and sin boldly. Not that we are earning our salvation, but that we aren't negating it either. Jesus says to us in this gospel from Matthew 13 that we have received God's love and God's grace without payment, so that we might turn around and bear fruit and give without payment. You ever notice how high the ceiling is in the sanctuary? This is not a very efficient thing. But hopefully it's effective in explaining that this is a different kind of room, and in this room our attention is directed in a different kind of way to a different kind of place. St. Stephen was built in phases. The farthest east wing of the church, the fellowship hall, was built first. It was originally the sanctuary, and then an addition was put on, an addition was put on, an addition was put on, and some changes were made, and all sorts of things went on, all the way until the building moved as far west as it currently sits, all the way out to the portico that extends the farthest west of the structure. And I have long said that somewhere along that process, St. Stephen should have probably stopped. That it wasn't really efficient. That we've built this building that's bigger than we need it to be. And we can make all sorts of arguments about how we now get to steward that and how hard that can be and how we can open ourselves up to the community maybe, and we can have all sorts of discussion on that. But this is a matter of going beyond efficiency and effectiveness and into taking risks in the certainty of our faith. We received Christ's love without payment, and we are to live in it and to give from it without payment. We are to spiritually and emotionally do the equivalent of walking into Lowe's, purchasing the most expensive seeds that we can find, or in the case of our spirits that have been given to us. And because Jesus and God can sow out of such great abundance and spread so far and wide, we are called to live that way. To move away from always worrying about effectiveness and efficiency, to reminding that there is a great abundance of joy and justice, and we mirror God and live in the Spirit and into the Spirit's calling when we sow as abundantly as God has sown for us. How often do we reach out to others and waste time? It isn't efficient, it may not be totally effective, but how often do we just waste time to live in joy? How often do we waste a moment or something that we have in order for it to be a moment set aside that God could do something with? God sows this seed without regard because the well is so deep, and we are drowned in the waters of the baptism that we receive in this well, and we live fully when we ourselves sow what seeds we have with the same sort of abundance and almost recklessness. May we move away from always being efficient and always being worried about how effective we are. May we be willing to live into joy. And when we stumble out into that place, may we learn again of how abundant God is, and that in the midst of all that abundance, God is reminding us that we are loved and that others are loved, and that this world is about more than what we can see or hear, but there's a depth too. Amen.